Well, welcome to the Shepherd Heart Leader podcast, where we explore topics that help strengthen your ability to care for those under your leadership. Now, today we have Reverend Mark Ritchie on the podcast. He is an evangelist based out of the United Kingdom. He is originally from Scotland, and he is a speaker, podcaster, storyteller, comedian, gospel proclaimer, and passionate rescuer. In this episode, Pastor Nate has a conversation with him about the office of an evangelism and how he carried a cross. You heard that right. He carried a cross across the United Kingdom. Take a listen to this conversation.
And so excited to have you. You were with our church recently on Sundays and then investing in our staff. And I think it'd just be great for those that are listening to this podcast to hear from you, because I think you do exemplify a shepherd-hearted leader from the office of evangelist. Often people only hear from a pastor, and it's all pastor-dominated. I think that, praise God for that. But I think even from your vantage point, I want people to hear a different angle, a different vantage point on many of the topics that we already talked about. So welcome, bro.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So first of all, people are going to hear your Scottish accent right away. So those of you who are just listening, you don't get to see Mark. He does have a Scottish background. Why don't you share with everyone your background, your family, that kind of thing?
Great. Yeah, so I'm from Edinburgh in Scotland, and I was a pastor's kid and loved God. I remember 12 was when I went forward and I gave my life to Jesus, and I never rebelled. I never turned away from it. I was full in, and even when I was 15, 16 at school, I was communicating. I remember being outside the school gates and actually I didn't know it was preaching. I didn't know that's what it was, but I was just telling everyone about Jesus. And I just went for it 100%. So I've always been like that guy.
Well, and that guy means that there's that humor side of you, the way to make people laugh. And that's a part of your preaching, but it's also bridged into outside of church context. Then what kind of drove you into that in the first place?
Yeah, so I went to Bible college, felt really called by God to do that. And then when I left Bible college, I went to be a minister in Barnsley in England. And that was going great, but absolutely everything I was doing was kind of just turning to people becoming Christians. So we took a youth group on, and there was 15 of them. We ended up with 200 young people really, really quickly. Now, I'm going to be upfront and honest that the discipling program was not amazing. And I'm really sad about that. But I was just so passionate about seeing young people connect with God, and we were just making amazing sort of kind of inroads into the schools, into the high schools, into the colleges. We were just seeing so many young people become Christian, and everything I was doing was just seeing many people come to faith. So people started to say, hold on, we think you might be an evangelist, you know. That was kind of how it happened. Lots of people around me just going, wait there, I think this guy's an evangelist.
And then there is a difference between a pastor and an evangelist. There's in Ephesians 4:11, there's different gifts given to the church. The office of evangelist isn't talked about that often. And the way church is done nowadays, in many places around the world, there's not even room for an evangelist sometimes. Right. What does an evangelist bring to the table?
Yeah, great question. I think that evangelists have just got this passion, this focus, this drive, that actually it's not about keeping the church people happy. It's not about making sure everyone's got their seat, but actually it's for the people that have not arrived yet. And that's the thing that's always burning inside of them. And I know that sometimes evangelists can be annoying for pastors because because we're always like, yeah, but like, what, you know, I don't care about that. All I care about is let's get people saved. And, you know, the pastor's trying to keep his flock happy. But, you know, I really think there is got to be more of a relationship between pastors and evangelists. I think sometimes pastors have seen evangelists as a little bit rogue, a little bit kind of, and I think that we've got to hold our hands up and say there has been a bit of a tradition of, you know, sometimes it has been a little bit of a like free spirit, and that we've not felt like we want to be pinned down and all that. But like from early on, I've always wanted to be super plugged into the local church. I'm an international evangelist, but I run a life group in my local church because I believe that we've got to be like plugged in, and there's no room anymore for like wild cowboys that are off doing their own thing. It's got to be about plugged into church and understanding how church works. So I think like evangelists have had to learn some stuff, but I also think like that pastors, you know, I mean, I've always loved you. We've always had that great connection, and I've always felt like you understood that evangelists are going to be slightly wired differently, and you've been able to give me space to do that, and that's been fantastic. But I think sometimes there has been some pastors that have been a bit intimidated by evangelists, felt like sometimes evangelists have been kind of, you know, all gifting and no character and stuff like that. But I think when the partnership works, and this is what we want to believe for, I think there needs to be more where evangelists feel really safe. That's one thing I feel that you do really well, is you make people feel safe. I can be myself, I can flourish, I'm in a safe place. But also I feel like pastors need to maybe like learn that you've got to understand that they are slightly different. You know, they are wired different, and they're going to be very focused and passionate.
Yeah. Yeah, the complementary nature of it, the way God put it together, doesn't always work that way.
Yeah,
I know that the super gift of an evangelist, people are awed. You come in and preach, and everybody's like, wow, they run to the altars, they give their life to Jesus. And I might hear from, or a pastor might hear, man, that guy can really speak. And if I'm insecure, I'm here, what do you think about my preaching? Right?
Exactly.
And so there has to be no competition in it, but to understand the complementary nature of the gifts to the church. Because evangelist is still a gift to the church.
Exactly, yeah.
Not just a gift out there,
exactly,
but a gift to the church to spur the church on to love people, love souls. A church, the longer it goes, can stop worrying and being burdened by the lost and people that are away from Jesus. An evangelist that comes in can really drive that home. And there are some people that in the ministry are gifted for the discipleship side of things.
Yes.
So after you win them, we don't want to lose them.
Exactly.
We don't want to birth them and leave them on the doorstep.
Exactly.
We want to grow them up in the house of God. And so there is that complementary nature of what can be. And I think from a shepherding standpoint, I'll throw my little 2 cents in on the relationship of pastor evangelist. I've looked at and observed for decades people that have a call from God outside of a church staff. So people that are in parachurch organizations, people that have a very focused mission. That could be to college campuses. It could be to an orphanage in the city. It could be to do media outside of the church, but it's supporting the kingdom of God. Many times they don't know what to do with their gifts when they come to church.
Exactly.
And so one of the things that I've said, if a person is giving their entire week to ministry and then they come to church, I don't need them to do my job.
Sure.
Right? Like I don't have, they don't need to pay their dues in church by serving in 8 different ministries, and then they're wore out going into their next week of ministry. Yeah. So I want to provide a covering for them where I honor their gift and their place and their value in the church without using them.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it really does.
And if a person is wise, I think in those contexts, they'll receive the pastoral covering instead of having to be known. In fact, there's a little bit of safety in anonymity.
Exactly.
Right? Like when you go to, you just market your church, right?
Yes.
Exactly. And so, but when you travel, I also want to provide what I can offer you, because you're bringing something to me and to our church, and you're inspiring us to care about the lost.
Yeah.
And you're stirring the church with what the church should be stirred with all along.
Exactly.
But the gravitational pull is to pull away from that. So thank you. Thank you for doing that so well for decades. Now, I want to transition just a little bit, because in your journey of ministry, you still preach in churches, but God began to birth in you a place to communicate the gospel outside the church years ago, utilizing some of your gifts with humor. Talk a little bit about your journey on the comedy side of things.
Yeah. Well, I was a youth evangelist for a lot of years, and that was brilliant in front of a lot of unsaved young people. And then when I started to sort of merge into all age evangelism, I was just getting frustrated, because 99% of the crowd was Christian. And I was just like, oh man, I want to be in front of unsaved people. And at that time, my wife took me to see a comedian, and it actually was really brilliant, because he was really funny. He wasn't a Christian, but he had a life message that he was communicating. And God spoke to me in the theater, and God said to me, I want you to do that. I want you to do a comedy show, but I want you to do like the message, and the message is the cross. And it was terrifying, but I had used humor in my youth ministry. I've always enjoyed laughing. I've always enjoyed, I call laughter fizzy holiness. It's like, I love it. And so we went for it. And that first time we did a theater show, about 70 people came, lots of non-Christians, and we went for it. And there were some moments that were brilliant and some that were terrible, but we knew that we were onto something. Yeah.
And this is powerful what you're speaking to audiences that aren't ordinarily hearing the gospel.
That's
right?
it.
So this is a whole new arena, and take some reps to get good at it, I suppose, and learn from it. And I think, man, that's amazing that you could shift into that zone and find a favor from God, and may God continue to use you. I also pray that God will raise up more people like you, Mark, where they can use their gifts, and even in humor, and you wouldn't be the only Christian comedian in that arena. In the long run, that God would raise those kind of people up. I want to kind of expand a little bit on this, because you shared a little bit of your personal story to our staff chapel, and it was wrapped up in something major that you did with the cross. And if you could you just take us through what you did with Staff Chapel a little bit?
So in 2011, UK had horrendous riots, and it was horrible. And I was devastated. I wept every night watching the images. It really broke me. And God spoke to me. And at that point, I was an evangelist. I was doing lots of work and traveling around. But God spoke to me, and God said, Mark, I want you to carry the cross over Great Britain. So I was like, yeah, God, of course, I'm going to carry the message of the cross. And God was like, no, I want you to carry an actual cross. And I was like, no, because maybe this is harsh, but I was like, it's only weird people that carry crosses. I didn't want to be part of that gang. And but God really kind of really challenged me. And so in 2012, I set off and I walked with a cross. So it was a cylindrical aluminium cross that I had on my back. And the reason we did that is because we invited people to write their sins on Post-it notes and put them inside the cross. And it was a powerful time. So we set off and we walked. I walked from Brighton in England right up to Edinburgh in Scotland. And then I got transported round to Wrexham in Wales, and I walked across to Hull. So we walked in the shape of a cross, 70 days, 700 miles. And we saw, by the end, the cross had got over 13,000 post-it notes in it. We saw people become Christians on the street. We saw them in events. We saw wonderful things. But I had like 5 lessons that I learned from carrying the cross that I just felt would be great to share. The first one, I just want to say, weep from a deep place. Those tears will take you far. And I feel like I remember that my journey started with me sobbing in my front room. And I think that, that I know, Pastor Nick, you know about this as well, but some of our grandmas and our grandpas, they knew how to weep for the lost. They would stay up through the night. They would cry. They would not be able to do anything as they cried out to God for souls. And sometimes I worry that we've lost a bit of that in the church. Sometimes I worry that people have become very complacent and the church gets a bit consumer orientated. We need to cry out to God. And, that's where it all started for me. It all started from me kind of weeping for the lost. And I was saying in chapel that, this is a difficult story to relate. And, I don't want to upset anyone, but my whole ministry kind of started from a place of real tears, because when I first started in Barnsley, we used to do schoolwork, and we did this little junior school, and it was a Monday morning, and the kids were all in, and I had got my lesson ready. And just before I got up, a little boy, it turned out he was about 9, he just stood up and he screamed. This scream that came from the bottom of his feet, he screamed. And the teachers went to try and kind of calm him down, but he knocked the teachers out the way, and he knocked chairs, and he ran out the back. And obviously the hall was chaos as the kids were crying. But, the headmaster calmed everyone down, and then he handed over to me, and I had to try and do my lesson in that atmosphere. But just after that, I was in his office, and he says, Mark, the reason why that little boy did that is because, on Friday, his dad took him to the local bar, stood him up on a bar stool, and says, whoever bids the highest can take this boy home. Do whatever you want to him. Just bring him back to school for Monday. And, when the headmaster told me that, even now I'm choking up. I just had these tears roll down my face. I knew it was unprofessional. I knew I should have held it together, but I could not help myself. The tears were bouncing off the carpet of the headmaster's office. And, I just saw a little vision, and I saw me taking the hand of God, and I saw myself taking the hand of the broken, that hurting little kid, and just bringing the two hands together. And, in that moment, I knew what my ministry was. That was going to be it for me. I was going to bring a broken and hurt and aching generation to God. And that's what's kept me going. And, my whole trip with the cross, it was those tears again that were and that, I think, that would be the first lesson. Weep from a deep place. Those tears will take you far. The second lesson that I learned was, I had this vision. I talked it over with my wife, and then we set up 2 meetings of 2 national leaders in the UK. And I went to see the first one, and I told them the vision. I told them about the cross and the post-it notes and where I was going to walk. And Pastor Nick, he just laughed. He just laughed. In fact, he buzzed his assistant to come through, and he says, "Oh, tell him what you're going to do." And now my confidence is just draining. And I told him, and they both were just laughing, saying, "That is so rubbish. Carrying a cross, that's stupid. People are just going to mock you. This is a stupid idea." I remember driving away, I told my wife, I don't know if I should do this. I was just absolutely... And my wife, she says, "No, listen, Mark, you've got this other meeting." And the week after, I'd got a meeting with a great evangelist called J. John. He's been to America many times. And J. John... I told him, but now I was not confident. Now I was almost like mumbling it, and I was looking at the carpet. I didn't really believe, And then I just kind of looked up, and as I looked up, he was just streaming, tears rolling down his face. And I mean, it's a few years ago. He got his checkbook out. Remember those? And he wrote for £1,000, and he said, listen, I want this to be the first £1,000 to this project. He goes, Mark, you must do this. He had no idea what other leaders had said, but he said, you must do this. This is incredible. And I think the second lesson that I learned, it's a little bit cheeky, but I say, choose wise people to speak into your life, because there are a lot of muppets out there. And I mean, people that are listening to the podcast, your podcast, they're listening to wise words, and I think it's so important to who we've got in our ears. There are people out there who will destroy. I think now, imagine thousands of people would not have heard the gospel if I'd have listened to that first leader. And I think, wow, we must make sure that we've got wise people speaking in our ears.
So good.
Yeah. And then I started to walk, and I was carrying this huge cross on my back, and we got to a part of London. So there's a few pockets of London where, there are a lot of Muslims in that area. And I was walking with a cross on my back. And as we were walking through, some Muslims started to gather around, and it was very intimidating. And I was beginning to get pushed and jostled, and I was feeling really frightened. And I'd got a group of people praying for me the whole time. And I got my phone kind of at the side of my pocket, and I was trying to message the words, I am scared. And in the kind of pushing around and predictive text, the guys at the prayer room got the words, I am sacred. So you can imagine they're looking at it going, oh, Mark, he's sacred. Great. And, what I really learned, that third lesson, is find the sacred in the scared. And, I just know that your story is true of this, and many of our stories are true of this, is that, we find God when we are frightened and we're nervous and we're worried and we're going for stuff. I think of all the listeners listening now, and you're feeling worried about taking that step. And, I just want to really encourage you that you find God in the scared. You find the sacred in the scared. It's amazing to think that, wow, we take that step of faith and God is right there. And we love to be comfortable, don't we? And I'm the same as everyone else. We want our comfort. And I think we are missing some great stuff when we choose that comfortable life. But let's go for more. Let's step out again. Let's take that risk. Let's throw ourselves out and find God. And, wow, we got through that moment and we laughed about, I am sacred. But it really became a lesson that we all live by. Find the sacred in the scared.
That's good.
Yeah. And then, just to say, we walked up, and near the end of the trip, we were walking across towards Manchester in England. It always rains in Manchester. And basically, I was absolutely soaking. And I got into this pub with the cross. I put it on the side of the wall, and I was just needing soup, and I just said to these ladies I says, have you got any soup? They were like, yeah, we'll get you some soup. And I was kind of soaking. My socks were wet. My shoes were wet. Everything was wet. And they came over and, God bless them. They came over and they says, can we ask you about this cross? And I was terrible. I was not a great... I just was like, listen. I says, listen, I'm wet. I'm cold. I just want to eat my soup. I'm carrying a cross. And people are putting Post-it notes in with their sins, and they're putting it in the cross. And I says, I just need to eat my soup. That was like my message. I mean, man, how terrible. And then I was eating my soup, and the guy that was walking with me, he just nudged me and said, Mark, you need to look over. And I looked over, and these two ladies... They didn't even feel like they could come and ask for a Post-it note because they thought, oh, this guy's a bit grumpy. They got napkins off the table And I saw this lady, she's writing this and she's having a cry. And I went over and I says, oh, I'm sorry, I'm a bit wet and grumpy. And she said, I'm writing abortion on this napkin because when I was a young teenage girl, I had an abortion. And she goes, I've never been able to forgive myself. And I feel like if I can just put it in this cross and that maybe Jesus could take that. And I got such a privilege of praying with her right there in that, in that place in Manchester. And so, wow, that fourth lesson was just let the cross do its work, yeah? I think sometimes we forget. Jesus, he knows what he's doing. You were
tired.
Yeah.
You were wiped out,
exactly.
But the cross was still going to work.
Exactly, that's it. And I feel like to encourage leaders, we communicate that message. And sometimes we beat ourselves up because we're not always communicating as incredible as... I love to think I'm a good communicator, but I messed up. I was terrible communication. But you know what? Jesus' cross still works, still does its stuff.
Wow.
Yeah, and then the last lesson, I always just say is never forget you're sent by the Father. And when we carried that cross through all kinds of atmospheres and different things, we didn't go in our own strength. We knew we were going and we were sent by God. I always tell a tiny little story about my brother and me fighting and, my little sister came up and I was 16, my brother was 14. There was blood. It was a bad fight. My little sister stood at the door and she said, stop fighting. And of course we were like, what are you talking about? And then she just said these words, Dad sent me. She came not in her own authority, she came in the authority of the Father. And I want to just encourage everyone listening, we do not come in our own strength. We have got the authority of the Father, sent by God. And what an incredible trip at the end to be able to put the cross in the center of the UK and see people respond to it.
That's amazing. So amazing. Thinking about the Father, you didn't want your dad to walk in.
No, that is absolutely true. That is true.
So the authority had some backup to it.
Yes, it really did. It really did.
And God's authority has backup to it as well.
Yeah.
That's powerful. What you did as you walked across. Have you used that cross in your future? Past that moment? What have you done with it?
We did. We used it in some events for the year following. And then I had a real powerful thing I did one final preach with it. And the final preach was called Beyond the Cross. And it was really powerful because what I said, I had this thing where I had a guy in the crowd with a rucksack. I didn't know I was going to say this, but what he did is he came and he brought the rucksack and he put it at the cross, and then he went. And then he came back and he picked it back up again. And then he went and then he came and he put it back. And I says, and some of us, we get into that loop, but we're not just like living our life, just like continually picking our baggage up. Yeah. There's got to be life beyond the cross. We've got to kind of like get that freedom that's like, I've left my stuff at the cross. Yeah. I leave it there. And now I like move into freedom. And after that sermon, I really felt God say, okay, that's cool. Yeah. And so we actually, we moved on beyond the cross. So it was a powerful thing. Yeah.
I was thinking in my pastoral lens that listening to that, I don't want people just to quote unquote get saved every week.
Exactly.
But, yes, they've given it over, they've surrendered, they've asked for forgiveness, and they start a new life that God gives them. But I don't want them to think that they got to keep coming back to the salvation point. They need to grow and be discipled and move on. And that's powerful. I love that. And that's the evangelist pastor relationship, right? Yeah. You can just say, take it from here, pastors, right?
Yeah.
Not my problem.
Exactly. I love that. It's like, the carnage, and then you just walk away and the pastor's there.
Peace out.
That's good.
Man, there's so many great things that are wrapped up in what you do and how God has used you. And I pray that your spirit becomes a part of us. And that's the whole way you came here this week was I was in prayer in the last year, and I felt like the Lord said that Emmanuel needed to hear from Mark Ritchie. And it wasn't anything they're hearing from me every week, or we have our staff that are preaching. But I think there's a gift that God brings that's different, that helps propel us and move forward. So I really do think it was a divine appointment for you to be here. And you have those divine appointments all the time, but you don't necessarily have the team to share it with. Like, you're going to be done with this week. I know this from my time of travel. And you're going to go back home, and your wife is going to say, so how'd it go? And you're going to say, good. But she wasn't here, or the people that you talk to maybe on your board, your ministry board, and the like. So I just want to share the win with you, and hopefully this extends into the future. We've got time for one more thought. You and I were driving down the road this week, and just talking about reflections on people on staff in churches, and the experience that they have with a lead pastor. And the culture of churches. And the larger a church is, the more levels and layers of leadership there are in the structure, in the org chart, and trying to create a culture where there's honor in all levels, of course, but not hero worship at the top, and having character, that backs it up, And so I know I'm doing this impromptu a little bit with you, but when you travel and you speak, you pick up on that. And you can see what's going on there. Now, you don't have control, but if there are warnings hidden in it, what would the warnings be to pastors on staff in churches, and maybe even business owners that have larger organizations and tiers of direct reports and then other people under them? What are the kind of the dangers in that, and what would you want to say? Don't do this, but maybe do something different.
Really good question. And I think it is like a unique place that I'm in, because I'm amongst it, but I'm not actually like on staff there, so I see a lot of things. And I remember, this is a weird sort of kind of thing to the side, but I remember hearing about in dog training that the dog trainer would like quickly move his hand, and however the dog responded, they could really tell what the owner was like. We can see what the owner does with his dog just by really quickly moving the hand. And I think, like, I've been in situations, I'm in green rooms, or and I can see like maybe a crisis has happened, or Sunday's busy, there's a lot of moving parts, and just even the way the staff come in and communicate to the senior leader, I'm like, oh, okay, it's one of those churches, I can tell. And I really feel like, for me, I'm not saying this just on the microphone, I've said this to you privately, and I say it many times. The thing I really respect about you is like there's a humility about you that is sometimes not always evident in all the leaders that I'm working with. And I was in a church, a big church in England recently, and the senior leader, he's doing really well, he's a charismatic guy, but you can really see that he as we sometimes say in England, he really loves himself, and you can tell that his ego, and you can see that his staff are having to manage his ego. And that is like a huge red flag for me. I can see, I'm watching when my eyes are open, and I'm listening to conversations, and I'm thinking, wow, most of the time these guys are nervous and keeping the guy's ego, and I'm like, wow. And I really feel like, we want to get back to that authentic like leadership where, people like that really spend time with us, they just sense Jesus, you know what I mean? I was in the car, like, I don't know if it was yesterday or the day before, and I thought, Lord, I can sense you here, even in our talk, just between us. And I was with Pastor Nathan, somebody else on your staff, and we're walking, and I sensed the Lord, and I think, this is what we want, isn't it? Is when you're with people, it shouldn't be about staff having to run around managing your ego, making sure that you feel honored. You know what I mean? I feel like that word has been abused a lot, the honor word, because it is right and true that we do need to respect and honor people, but honor should not be about managing people's egos. So for me, I'm like, Lord, I want to be authentic, and I want the people that like are looking after your child, I want them to be real and true. And you know, the bigger the gifting is, the more challenging that is. That's the terrifying bit.
Yeah, and we're all one step away from being prideful. Like, hey, you kind of slipped. That made me feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And whether it's my wife or one of our teammates, I can get talking and not realize I might have offended somebody, or I might have unintentionally hurt someone. And then when they confront me or they say that information to me, that's when I need to go, you're right. That's when I need to pause. If I run over that and I skip over that, then I become a hard heart.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And it doesn't feel good when somebody tells me that they didn't feel comfortable or I was too pushy or whatever. It doesn't feel good. Yeah. But at that moment, I need to pause and go, you're right, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And do it before the Lord, but also do it with people.
And do you feel like some pastors feel like by saying that I don't always get it right, that they lose credit with their congregation? Do you feel some of them, because in my experience, you gain more respect from your congregation because they're like, he's honest, he's vulnerable, he's real. But I feel like some pastors feel like if I was kind of honest on the pulpit, I would lose the respect of them because they want me to be the perfect man.
Yeah. Yeah, there's scales to this, right? So there are things I don't drop my guard from when I'm preaching on Sunday. Sure. But I think people pick up the feel of it too.
Yeah.
Like if I'm covering things up or I'm false, I'm covering, that's an insecure leader. I think insecurity is the biggest thing that pastors deal with. I would agree, yeah. And you know what? It's not because they're bad people. They want to be liked.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
and if somebody says that I don't like you, what's wrong with me?
Yeah.
So I do think that it's important to pay attention to the inner voice and narrative that you have too, because if you can learn to hear both praise and criticism without it affecting who you are.
Yeah.
Learning to deflect the praise back to the Lord or to the team that you're on, and it's not all about you.
Yeah.
Emmanuel's not my church, it's God's church.
Yeah.
Those kind of, those are big differences, right?
Yeah.
And if your identity is not fused with the uniform or the position that you have.
Sure.
So, because every pastor is an interim pastor. So I'm only here for a season.
Exactly.
And it's God's church.
Yeah.
But if I feel like I'm threatened, then I become like Saul throwing a spear at David.
Yeah.
And that old book, Tale of Three Kings?
Yeah.
That's excellent to pull out for pastors of any stage.
Yeah.
Because everyone has a Saul or an Absalom or a David in them, or options to become them.
Exactly.
When you're faced with these circumstances. So I think that's the big thing. I think our culture has elevated perfection too on an Instagram universe, if you will, where everything is perfect. Only our best cuts from a message get on reels, right? And so they're not putting our mistakes up there, our stuttering up there. They're not putting those things on there. So that kind of builds it up to the point where if you feel like you got to be perfect or you'll lose it, then you've made the ministry about you.
Yeah.
Right? If and then you lead to not lose.
Sure.
And then you see in others things that may be a threat to your leadership, then that's a dangerous place to be. And you don't want to be in that kind of place. Sure. I think an evangelist would feel that way too as well. And everybody's got that, well, what if it goes viral? What if other people think? What if people leave my church? And what if the offerings go down? And what if the domino effect of it? And I think leaders can get in a place where they insulate themselves.
Yeah.
And they no longer are aware of where the people are.
Yeah. So good.
Right? And so that's why we call it the Shepherd Heart Leader.
Yeah.
This podcast is because there has to be a consistent drive to think about the people God has called us.
Yes.
And the interesting thing here is both you and I have different offices in the church.
Yes.
But we will both care for the sheep.
Yes.
Jesus left the 99
Exactly.
to go after the one.
Yeah.
That's the evangelist and the pastor at times.
Yeah.
But the pastor still cares about the 99 along the way. And I think the ultimate thing for any leader that God calls or raises up is that we need to be people that are thinking about the sheep first and ourselves second.
Yeah.
And if you're thinking about yourself first, there's a problem. And the people that are working around you are there to build up your ministry. That's not Jesus style leadership.
Yeah.
Right? I know that the people around me that are working with, they're doing their best in the roles that they're in, but that's not all they are.
Sure.
That's what their assignment is for right now. I'm grateful that we're on the same team.
Yeah.
But they might do other things down the road.
Yeah.
And if God chooses to call them to do something else, I can't get insecure about that. I need to bless what God is doing, not see it as, oh, they're leaving me.
Yeah.
Or they're letting me down.
Yeah.
Well, it's not about me.
Yeah.
Right? So there you go.
Yeah. Wow.
I mean, there's so many aspects of this that I think.
I mean, I don't know if we've got time. We've got time for a time. It just reminded me when you were speaking there, but I went and did an event in England, and the numbers were really low.
Yeah.
And I was really devastated, and we were going up the stairs into the auditorium, and I'd heard that the numbers are low. And the pastor put his hand on my shoulder, and on the way up, he says, "Mark, the numbers are really low tonight. We're sorry. It's our fault. It's not your fault. We have not done a good job of promoting this. And I know right now in your head and in your mind, you're beating yourself up and saying, oh, how has this happened? It's me. It wasn't you, Mark. And we just want to say we're really sorry." And honestly, Pastor, that really I started to cry, because I've been in so many situations where, pastors say the joke, "Oh, it's a bit quiet tonight. They must have heard you were coming." That kind of joke.
Right.
And even though it's just a joke, the evangelist is like, "Oh."
Yeah.
And that guy, he just put his hand on my shoulder.
Took
and
all the pressure off you.
Yeah. And I think that's what we're talking about today.
Yeah.
That pastor and evangelist working.
Yeah.
And I just said, thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
And actually in the end, we had actually more people come than we thought.
Yeah.
And it turned, but what a great pastor and evangelist moment.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to further conversations with you. We've sent Kingdom Builder teams to the UK, and we're going to continue to do that. And I look forward to our friendship in the future as well. Thank you for giving your time on the Shepherd Heart Leader podcast today.
God bless.
Wow, what a great conversation. We're so glad that you took the time to listen today. As always, we love to hear from you. Please leave a comment and like and subscribe. And we'll leave all the resources in the description of the podcast. Until next time, keep leading well.